Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In this video, we're going to have a look at the 1176 Classic Limiter plugin collection by Universal Audio. The 1176 is an iconic piece of equipment used in music production. It's used to apply compression and limiting to signals, and it's known for its tone and its punch and its character. And so in this video, we'll have a look at the three different versions of the 1176 that you get in this plugin collection. We'll have a look at how to use each of these plugins, and I'll also give you 6 tips for things that I think that you need to know about to get the best out of an 1176 plugin. So first and foremost, let's have a look at what's included in the 1176 Classic Limiter plugin collection. In this bundle, you get 3 different versions of the 1176, or 3 different generations of the 1176 compressor. The first is the Rev A, or you may sometimes hear it referred to as the Blue Stripe, and this is based on the original design of the 1176. The next is the Rev E, or the 1176 LN, which stands for Low Noise, and then there is the 1176 AE, and that stands for Anniversary Edition. Now, the Rev E is probably the most commonly used version of the 1176, and it works really, really well for pretty much any instrument. The Rev A is known for being a little bit more gritty, maybe a little bit more aggressive. It distorts a little more readily. And then the Anniversary Edition gives you some options that the other 2 plugins don't. And having that option in this collection of plugins actually makes this quite a versatile collection of compressors. So before we start to go into the specifics of these different compressors, let's start by having a listen to an 1176 in action. I'll start with the compressor bypassed, and then I'll switch it on. Then I'll bypass it again, I'll switch it on again so you can hear the difference with and without the compression. And we'll use the Rev E for this. So let's have a look at each of the parameters on these compressors. Okay, so the first parameter we have is the input parameter. Now, on a lot of compressors, we might be more used to seeing a threshold parameter. Instead of a threshold parameter, the way this compressor works is it has a fixed threshold, so the threshold is set at a certain level. So rather than lowering a threshold so that more of the signal is being compressed, we instead increase the input so that more of the signal is overshooting that fixed threshold. And the more you increase the level at the input, the more you can push the compressor to distort as well. So it's turning the level of the signal up, which is in turn controlling how much the signal overshoots the threshold and how much you push the compressor into distortion. Now, because we're increasing the level that's going into the compressor with the input parameter, it's important to have an output parameter that controls the level of the signal that's coming out of the compressor. Now, that output parameter doesn't have any impact on the compression that's being applied. It's turning the level of the signal up and down after it's being compressed. But it's worth bearing in mind that the output control can still change the sound, because you can get distortion out of the compressor the more you turn up the output. So whereas with some compressors, the output is purely just controlling the level of that signal coming out of the compressor, with this output, you can gain some distortion, and so you can change the sound of the signal depending on how much you drive that output control. Now, the next 2 parameters to look at are the attack and the release. Now, the attack and the release parameters are a little bit unique on an 1176. With a lot of compressors, they would start at their fastest setting and you can slow the attack and release down. Whereas here, it starts with the slower setting and you can speed up the attack and release time. So here, the slowest setting for the attack and release time is 1, and the fastest setting for the attack and release time is 7. So that's the opposite way around to a lot of compressors. Now, something to note about an 1176 is that whilst we talk about fast or slow attack and release times, 1176s are very, very fast compressors. So the attack time runs from 20 microseconds to 800 microseconds, and the release time runs from 50 milliseconds to 1100 milliseconds. And so that's a key characteristic of the 1176 compressor, is that they're very fast compressors. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind with these attack and release settings. First and foremost, the attack time will differ slightly depending on which of the 3 plugins you're using, but it will also differ slightly depending on which ratio you choose. And so here you can see that on each compressor, we can choose from a predetermined set of ratio values. And so with these ratio values, the lower the ratio, the faster the attack time. Secondly, when it comes to the release time will also vary slightly depending on which plugin you're using, and it will also vary slightly depending on what type of signal it is that you're compressing. Now, after the input, the output, the attack, the release, and the ratio, finally, we have control over this VU meter. And so we can set it to gain reduction like this. And so this will show us how much the compressor is turning the signal down. Or you can view the level of the signal that's coming out of the compressor. And you can view that at either +4 or +8 decibels. Or finally, you can use this off switch and that will bypass the compressor. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Anniversary Edition has a couple of options that the other two plugins don't have, and that open up a couple of options to you. And those differences are concerned with the attack time and the ratio. So if you look here, whereas each of these two compressors have the option of a 4:1 ratio, 8:1, 12:1, or 20:1, with the Anniversary Edition, you have the option of 2:1, 4:1, 8:1, or 20:1. So the Anniversary Edition of the plugin gives you a 2:1 ratio. So it gives you the opportunity to apply a more gentle compression if that's something that you want to do with your 1176 compressor. And if you look to the attack time on the Anniversary Edition, you can also see that it has this slow option. Now, as I said, 1176s are very fast compressors, but what this slow option lets you do is it lets you apply an attack time of 10 milliseconds. And so that can certainly open up some options to you in terms of applying more gentle compression with a lower ratio, or being able to apply compression with a slower attack time. So let's have a listen to the compressor using this slow 10 millisecond attack time, and then we'll compare it to just using a slow attack time on the compressor, but not using the slow option itself, the 10 millisecond option. So you can hear there that because it's a slower attack time, it's letting quite a lot of the transients come through, and it's retaining the punch in the track. Now let's keep the compressor on the slower side, but we're not using the slow setting itself. So you can hear there that the compressor is clamping down on a lot of those transients, and we're losing the punch, even though the attack time is still set to a slow attack time for this compressor. Whereas if we now go back to the slow setting by clicking on the word slow, we should hear that punch come back. Now, we've talked a lot there about attack, release, ratio, and things like that. If any of these terms are unfamiliar to you, or if you're not sure what any of these parameters actually do on a compressor, then I would encourage you to download my free compression cheat sheet. That explains what each of the parameters on a compressor do, whether it's the threshold, the ratio, the attack, the release, the knee, and so on. And it teaches you how to get different results from a compressor, whether that be to make signals more punchy, or to make signals sound fatter, or to achieve level balance in your mixes. And of course, these aren't parameters that are specific only to an 1176 compressor. These are universal across all compressors. So when you learn how each of these different parameters work on a compressor, you can apply this to any compression plugin. Now, you can get that EQ cheat sheet completely free when you head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads, and I'll leave a link on screen. Okay, so we've looked at the different parameters that these compressors have. Now let's move on to 6 things that I think that you need to know about to get the best results out of an 1176 compressor. Now, first and foremost, if you've used an 1176 before, or you're familiar with 1176 compressors, you'll be familiar with the all buttons in option. And that's the first one that I want to talk about. So if you hold down Shift and you press in each of the buttons, you can see that all of the buttons are pressed at once on your ratio options. So rather than just selecting one at a time, like we normally would, we can select all of the options at once. Now, this can be great for creating an effect with this compressor because it gives you a lot of compression and a lot of distortion. Let's have a listen to that. We'll start with the compressor off and then we'll switch it on. And so as you can hear, that creates a very heavily distorted and heavily compressed sound, which can be used as quite a unique effect. Now, obviously, applying that much compression might be a little bit too much in most circumstances. And so that brings us to tip number 2. So you'll see here you have this mix option. So what we can do here is we can dial in the balance between the compressed signal and the uncompressed signal. So by default, you're only hearing the compressed signal. But let's try dialing in some of the uncompressed signal to see if we can kind of tone this down a little bit. So there you're retaining some of the uncompressed and natural sound mixed with the heavily compressed sound. And so you can dial in a balance between the two, which can be really useful. And of course, this isn't only useful if you're using this all buttons in effect. You could do this at any point with your compression to dial in some settings, but then dial it back a little and find a balance between the compressed and the uncompressed version of the signal. Now, tip number 3, something else you can do with the ratio is you don't only have the options of either using the ratio in a normal way, say 4:1 or 8:1 or 12:1 or 20:1, or using the all buttons in effect where all of the ratio buttons are pressed. You can use multiple buttons at once without using all 4, and that gives you sort of different flavors of the all buttons in effect, different variations if you like. So let's try that. And so you can play around with those different settings and you can get very unique and unusual effects using different combinations of buttons on your ratio options. Now for tip number 4, something that you can do with an 1176 is you can pass a signal through the compressor to get the tone and the character and some of the distortion from that compressor without actually applying any compression. There are 2 ways of doing this. The first way to do this would be to hold down Shift and then click on whichever of the ratios is selected. And then once all of the buttons are out and none of them are pressed in, the compressor won't actually apply any gain reduction. It won't apply any compression. You'll just pass the signal through the compressor to get the tone of the compressor. And the other way of doing this on the Rev A and Rev E is if you set the attack to this off option. And the way to do that is you can't move around to it here. You've actually got to click on the word off. Then once again, the compressor won't apply any compression. It will just let the signal pass through it to pick up the tone or the distortion or the character of the compressor. So let's have a listen to this, and we'll have a listen to this using the Rev A because we haven't listened to this one yet. So we'll start with the plugin bypassed and then I'll bring it in and you should hear that distortion and that character from the compressor even though we're not applying any compression. And so you can hear there we get the distortion and the tone without actually applying any gain reduction. Now the 5th tip, the 5th thing to be aware of, is this little headroom control that we have on each of the compressors. So what this allows you to do is decrease the amount of headroom that the compressor has if you come over to the minus side, or increase the amount of headroom that the compressor has if you go over to the plus side. Now, if you give the compressor more headroom, then you'll be able to increase the input to a higher level before compression starts. And vice versa, if you decrease the headroom, then the compression will kick in at lower input levels. So this is a really good way of kind of fine-tuning the way that your compressor is operating if you want to get higher levels of compression or distortion, for example. Okay, and now the 6th and final thing to be aware of on an 1176 compression plugin is the sidechain filter. So the sidechain filter makes the compressor a bit less sensitive to what's going on in the low end of the signal. So if you look at the release parameter on each of the plugins, you see this line. If you click the word release, or you click this line, you'll see this raises up. What that means is that the sidechain filter is active. So let's have a listen and look particularly at the VU meter to see the different way that this responds when the sidechain filter is active. So let's start with it off, and then I'll turn the sidechain filter on, and what you'll see and hear is that the compressor will become less responsive to the kick drum and what's going on in the low end. And so this can be really, really useful because low end can trigger a compressor more than the mids and the higher frequencies. And so sometimes you need to bring that under control in some sort of a way so that the low end isn't causing a lot of compression to be applied to the entire signal. And so a way you can do that is to use this sidechain filter. And so I think that this collection of 1176 plugins is a really useful bundle of compressors to have when you're mixing. Generally, I use the Rev E for most things, but I'll use the Rev A when I want something to sound a little bit more gritty or a bit more aggressive, or I want a bit more distortion. And then I'll use the Anniversary Edition as and when I want to make use of that slow attack time or a more gentle ratio setting with the 2:1 ratio. And so having access to these 3 plugins is something that I find really, really useful in mixing. Now, throughout this video, I've been using Luna. Luna is a DAW by Universal Audio, and there's a free version of Luna, which I think a lot of people will find very useful. If you want to find out more about Luna, I'll leave a video on screen that I think you'll enjoy. Don't forget to head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads for that free compression cheat sheet. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.